We, the people watching this, share a secret. It's not written in the history books we read in school, but it is etched into the deepest parts of our DNA, woven into the very fabric of our species' improbable triumph. Our story is built on relentless success. We call it the out-of-Africa migration. 70,000 years ago, give or take, our ancestors, modern humans just like you and me, poured out of the cradle continent and began an epic-defining conquest. We tend to visualize this as a steady, inevitable march, a glorious tide washing over the globe. We think we won. And we did. We are the inheritors of that victory. But the story we rarely tell is the one about the friction, the dead ends, and the terrifying existential cost of that global ambition. Because for every wave that reached the shores of the future, there was another wave that simply vanished. Not physically, but socially, culturally, and historically. Imagine, for a moment, that humanity is not one flowing river, but a delta, a massive fan of tiny streams. Most of those streams dried up or merged back into the main channel, but a handful of desperate trickles, were diverted by geological accident, environmental cruelty, or sheer bad luck into a territory they could never escape. We are talking about the forgotten species, not Neanderthals, not Denisovans. We are talking about us. A contingent of genetically modern Homo sapiens who were perfectly capable of building the future, but who were marooned by time itself. When we look back at the incredible speed of human expansion, reaching Australia by 65,000 years ago, pushing into Europe later, and sparking the spectacular cultural explosions we see at sites like Lascaux, we focus on the winners. But while one branch of our family tree was learning to paint bison on cave walls, another branch was living in a kind of permanent, terrified medieval stasis, a cultural black hole stretching across millennia. To understand this tragedy, you have to understand the terrible vulnerability of knowledge. We take progress for granted. We assume that once a good idea is invented, like how to make a composite tool, or how to reliably start a fire, or how to process toxins out of a specific root, that knowledge is locked in forever. It isn't. Knowledge is a collective memory, and if the collective shrinks too far, if the population falls below a critical threshold, the wisdom of generations evaporates like morning mist. This is the isolation paradox. Our ancestors were the ultimate generalists, capable of adapting to almost anything. But that adaptability requires a social engine. It requires trade, interaction, competition, and a constant flow of new minds bringing new ideas. Now imagine a group, and archaeological evidence strongly suggests such groups existed, who found themselves cut off, perhaps by rapidly rising sea levels, perhaps by environmental shifts in deep interior Asia, creating impassable deserts or frozen wastes. They might have been a few hundred people, trapped on a new island or penned into an inhospitable geographical cul-de-sac. They had inherited the full toolkit of humanity when they left Africa: language, fire, basic tools, complex social structures. But their isolation was absolute. Think about what happens next. The environment changes. They need a specialized tool, say, a spear thrower, or a particularly efficient way to stitch tailored clothing for a sudden cold snap. But because their group is so small, and the input of new ideas is zero, that specialized knowledge is held by only a few elders. When those elders die in a famine, or in a localized tragedy, the knowledge dies with them. There is no one outside their immediate group to teach it again. Slowly, agonizingly, they begin to forget how to be us. Academics have long pondered the fate of these highly peripheral, ultra-isolated populations. In some remote areas, the archaeological record shows something deeply unsettling: technological regression. While other Homo sapiens were inventing bows and arrows, these isolated groups were sometimes found to be using simpler, cruder tools identical to those used by the main human population 20, 30, or even 50,000 years prior. They weren't unintelligent. They weren't lesser people. They were simply starved of social contact. Their struggle wasn't against ice or beast. It was against the terrible slow-motion erasure of culture. They were living in a world where the highest human ambition became simply hold the line. Don't forget what we knew yesterday. We look at the massive time gaps in our ancient history and often fill them with grand migrations and epic hunts. We forget the silence, the tens of thousands of years where these groups struggled to maintain a viable population size, trapped in a geographic prison while the rest of the species vaulted forward toward agriculture and civilization. Imagine them looking up at the sky. They know they came from somewhere. They have myths and oral histories about a massive journey, about a wider world full of other people. But those people never came back. No scout, no trader, no missionary ever returned across the impassable desert or the rising ocean to confirm that the rest of the species was thriving. They were fundamentally abandoned. And the hardest part of this history, the fact that chills the blood of anthropologists, is that the very traits that made us human, our intelligence, our adaptability, became chains in this isolated context. The anxiety, the profound awareness of their own loneliness, and the slow, inescapable realization that they were the last vestiges of a successful species that had somehow chosen to leave them behind. This is a weight we cannot possibly comprehend. We have found the faint traces of these lost populations. Sometimes they appear as anomalies in genetic data, a tiny, deep branch of the family tree that splits off tens of thousands of years earlier than everyone else. Sometimes they appear as stone tools on a forgotten island that look jarringly primitive compared to the cultural complexity of their contemporaries just a few hundred miles away. This wasn't just survival. This was social atrophy. This was humanity's grand experiment in conquering the world, suffering massive collateral damage. We must confront the fact that our success was predicated on their failure. And the question that haunts the archaeological record, the existential mystery that these forgotten people pose to us, the comfortable inheritors of global civilization, is this. What happens when the world leaves you behind and you are forced to fight not against nature, but against the terrifying decay of your own humanity? What happens when you realize that your entire society is nothing more than a few thousand doomed souls, perpetually stuck in the Paleolithic, while the rest of your species is already beginning to plan how to reach the moon? To understand this colossal abandonment, we have to grasp one horrifying fact about our species. We need each other to stay smart. We talk a lot about the incredible genius of Homo sapiens, how we spread across the globe like a biological wildfire. But we rarely discuss the logistics of that fire, how easy it was for sparks to land in places that turned into dead zones. Imagine the greatest time of change in human history, the Upper Paleolithic. Every new discovery, a better spear thrower, a method for drying fish, a new knot, didn't just happen once. It had to spread. The reason Europe exploded with cave art and complex tools wasn't that the people there were inherently smarter. It was because they had a massive, interconnected social network stretching for thousands of miles, constantly reinforcing and upgrading shared knowledge. It was the first human internet, built on trade routes, gossip, and shared dangers. Now picture a group that misses the memo, not because they were incompetent, but because the geography literally betrayed them. We have a powerful example of this human decay, a place that serves as a pristine, tragic laboratory, Tasmania. Roughly 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age was drawing to a close, sea levels began to rise catastrophically. The small land bridge connecting the island of Tasmania to mainland Australia, a place known today as the Bass Strait, was drowned. It took decades, perhaps centuries, but eventually the separation was complete. A few thousand souls, the direct descendants of the pioneers who first walked into this corner of the world, were permanently marooned. They were now completely alone. The rest of the human story, the Neolithic Revolution, the invention of agriculture, the wheel, writing, bronze, iron, would happen without them. But the isolation didn't just freeze their technology, it caused it to regress. This is the critical, bone-chilling detail you need to understand about cultural evolution. When your population drops below a critical threshold, some academics estimate 5,000 people are necessary to maintain significant cultural complexity. You don't just stop inventing things. You actively forget how to do the things you already knew. Think about that for a second. Imagine you possess the collective knowledge of your ancestors, but the society necessary to keep that knowledge alive has shrunk so small that the complex skills can't be passed down reliably. The master flint knapper dies, and the apprentice only learns half the technique. The specialized tool is too much effort to remake, and soon everyone forgets the use for it entirely. The Tasmanian people, when finally encountered by European sailors in the 17th and 18th centuries, possessed the most simplified technology known to any modern human group on Earth. They had abandoned technologies their ancestors, living on the island just a few thousand years prior, definitely possessed. They lost the ability to fish with hooks or nets. For thousands of years, archaeologists tell us, they largely stopped eating scale fish altogether, focusing instead on mollusks and seals. They stopped using bone tools. They lacked effective clothing in a sometimes freezing climate, relying instead on heavy body grease. They didn't have boomerangs. Crucially, they lost the ability to start fire themselves. If their communal flame went out, they had to desperately borrow fire from another group, or else wait for a lightning strike. This is cultural oblivion in real time. It's not that they weren't smart enough. They were facing an impossible equation. Every generation became a little more vulnerable, a little more constrained by the crushing weight of their small numbers. Why? Because complexity requires redundancy. If you and I are part of a massive society, and I spend 5 years perfecting the art of deep-sea fishing with a specific harpoon, and then I drown, my knowledge is likely preserved because I trained a dozen others. If we are an isolated group of 4,000, and I spend 5 years on that harpoon, and then I drown, that 5 years of accumulated knowledge disappears forever. For the people trapped in Tasmania, every single individual was priceless, yet every death was an intellectual disaster. They were locked in an endless cultural arms race against entropy. They couldn't afford complex innovation because the inherent risk of specialized knowledge was too high. You simplify everything you do to ensure maximum survivability of the technique itself, even if it makes life harder. What we are witnessing in the archaeological record of places like Tasmania is the dark side of humanity's success, the horrific efficiency of cultural decay when the network fails. We look at the beautiful Paleolithic tools we find globally, marveling at the skill, but when we look at the late period Tasmanian tools, we see something crude, something heavy, something almost desperate. Not because of a lack of intelligence, but because the social engine required to forge and maintain those techniques had simply run out of fuel. Imagine being one of those individuals. You look at the sea and you know deep in your collective memory that there is more land out there. You know that your ancestors crossed the water to get here. You might even still have the myth of the Great Crossing. But the boats they used are gone. The skills to build them are gone, and the terrible realization settles in. We cannot leave. You are the last custodians of a Paleolithic existence, while across the waters, out of sight and out of mind, others who share your DNA are building pyramids and writing down laws. Your world is shrinking daily. Their world is expanding infinitely, and there is absolutely nothing you can do but watch your collective intelligence slowly, inevitably, wither and die. The isolation didn't just affect technology. It affected their very understanding of what a human community could be. They were forced to live perpetually at the edge of extinction, where every neighboring group wasn't just a competitor, but a necessary but dangerous other. And that fragile, localized existence, entirely cut off from the global current of humanity, would only truly shatter when the inheritors of that global civilization finally remembered they existed. We arrived on their shores, armed with 10,000 years of continuous shared cultural development. And for the forgotten species, the end of their isolation meant only one thing: the end of everything. You have to understand something crucial about that 10,000-year gap, that period of utter silence between the groups that left and the groups that stayed. We often talk about technological superiority in terms of guns and steel, but that's the final, brutal expression of a divergence that began far earlier, deep in the Neolithic. The difference wasn't just metal versus stone, it was an exponential leap in collective cognitive capacity and, chillingly, biological resilience. For us, the inheritors of global civilization, and I mean us, the species that eventually farmed, wrote, and sailed, we went through the agricultural revolution. We paid a terrible, invisible price for it. When we domesticated animals and started cramming ourselves together in unprecedented density, the environment fought back. It gave us the Black Death, the smallpox, the endless grinding waves of childhood killers. But here is the terrible paradox. The survivors of those plagues were the foundation of our strength. We inherited immunities. We became biologically attuned to dense communal living. The forgotten species, living in their small mobile bands, never experienced this baptism by fire. They were isolated, pristine, and perfectly adapted to their environment. An environment where their biggest worry was a famine, a bad hunt, or the axe of the neighboring band. They existed at the human scale. A community was 70 people, maybe 100. A tragedy was a loss of 5 lives. Now, imagine the inheritors of 10 millennia of agricultural life, a culture where 1 million people could be gathered into a single urban center, where disease could wipe out a quarter of the population and the empire would still stand because the core system, the farming, the writing, the knowledge repository, was too vast to fail. We developed what historians call crowd diseases. Auk. They are diseases that need thousands of hosts just to survive and propagate. When we arrived, armed with the culmination of history, our ships weren't just carrying cannons and iron tools. They were carrying 10,000 years of epidemiological evolution. They carried germs that to us were merely seasonal irritations, a mild flu, a common cold, the diseases that kept our population in check but didn't destroy us. For the isolated people, the arrival of these invisible passengers was the arrival of the apocalypse itself. Their immune systems had absolutely zero preparation for pathogens that had evolved inside cattle, pigs, and massive urban sanitation systems. They didn't just get sick, their bodies had no mechanism even to recognize the invasion. It was total immunological naivete. The archaeological record of contact, whether you look at the Caribbean, the Amazon, or parts of Oceania, tells a story so grim it feels fictional. You don't need massacres to achieve genocide when you have this kind of biological gap. You just need a cough. Imagine being one of those people. You see these strange pale creatures arrive in impossible boats. They have metal, tools that cut wood with ridiculous ease, shining armor that shrugs off your finest spears. You might be scared, but you are also curious. You are a human being. You trade, perhaps you share a meal. Then, within days or weeks, your small, precious world starts to unravel. It doesn't begin with a battle cry. It begins with a fever. It begins with the old ones, the repositories of all your oral history, the keepers of your creation myths, suddenly shaking, incoherent, and dying with frightening speed. Then the children, whose small lungs cannot fight off the invisible siege. In a community of 70, if 20 people die in a week, you have lost the ability to hunt, gather, and defend. You have lost the social structure that defines your entire existence. And here is the psychological horror that you and I, living in this globally connected world, can barely fathom. They had no concept of contagious disease. They had no idea what was killing them. When 20 people die of measles in a traditional European town in the 15th century, it is a tragedy. But the concept is understood. It's the plague. It's God's wrath. It's bad air. It fits within their cosmology. For the isolated species, this was pure, inexplicable cosmic horror. Why were the people who touched the newcomers dying? Was it sorcery? Was it a curse brought by the iron gods? the internal structure of their belief, the very trust they had in the world they inhabited, shattered immediately. And while they are reeling, watching their population density plummet from 70 people to 30 in a matter of months, the inheritors of the global civilization, the ones who unknowingly carried the biological weapon, barely notice. They see an empty land, ripe for the taking. They see scattered bands of sick, terrified people who offer no meaningful resistance. This wasn't a fair fight. This was a sophisticated, 10,000-year-old biological and intellectual machine encountering an exquisite but fragile work of art. We speak about the isolation as a failure to advance, but it was really a perfect adaptation to a small, enclosed world. They adapted away from the great global current. And when the current returned, it didn't just wash over them, it dissolved them. The diseases moved faster than the colonists. In many places, when the true colonizing forces arrived, they found landscapes that were already utterly silent, populated only by skeletons and ghosts. The forgotten species was often gone before we, the invaders, even knew how vast their population had truly been. They were erased by a sickness that we had already domesticated in our own backyards. And that silent, rapid disappearance is what allowed the inheritors of the expanding world to write the history as if the land was empty all along, as if this wasn't a brutal collision between two separate timelines of human existence, but merely the natural expansion of the superior culture. But the isolation didn't just make them vulnerable to our germs and our steel. It fundamentally reshaped the way they understood and managed their resources. And the subtle details of that isolated existence would, in turn, become the next lever we pulled to ensure their world could never be rebuilt. Their lack of massive surpluses, their very dependence on the immediate environment, meant that a subtle shift in the ecosystem, a shift brought about by our arrival, could guarantee their complete annihilation, even if the germs didn't finish the job. We didn't just bring death. We brought an impossible new world that rendered their way of life instantly, irrevocably obsolete. This is where the story stops being about biological resistance and starts being about physics. Imagine two tectonic plates moving at glacial speed for 10 millennia, suddenly forced into a head-on collision. The isolated cultures, the forgotten species we are tracking, had achieved what academics call a climax ecosystem. This wasn't some static, pastoral paradise. It was intensely managed, but managed across generations, with a deep, intuitive knowledge of the carrying capacity of their landscape. When you live in a defined territory for thousands of years, reliant on only what that territory provides, you figure out the limits. You understand the subtle shift in the water table, the minimum viable population of the deer, the exact 3-year cycle required for certain roots to regenerate. Their systems were not based on maximizing output. They were based on maximizing longevity. They specialized in resilience. But resilience against a slow internal pressure is useless against a sudden external catastrophe. The expansionist culture, our ancestors, the inheritors of the Eurasian supercontinent, operated on fundamentally different assumptions. We assumed surplus was endless. We assumed land was something to be owned exclusively, titled, fenced, and ultimately transferred for profit. We brought with us the ironclad, devastating logic of monoculture and privatization. For most of these isolated cultures, the land was a commons, held collectively, managed through kinship ties and usage rights. A specific valley was used by the brown bear clan during the spring hunt. The lower river area was reserved for fishing by the water people during the spawning season. These rights were complex, overlapping, and utterly incompatible with a surveyor's chain and a government deed. When we arrived, we didn't just claim the land, we made their entire system of resource management instantly criminal, or at best, invisible. Think about the grass. This sounds trivial, but it is perhaps the single greatest silent killer we deployed. Across the Americas, Australia, and many parts of Asia, native ecosystems were adapted to specific grazers, bison, kangaroos, perhaps camelids in the Andes. They were fast-moving, relatively low density, and their digestive systems and hoof structures were perfectly adapted to native flora. Then we introduced cattle, sheep, and pigs. These were heavy, hoofed tanks built for high density. They arrived carrying new seeds, new weeds that flourished in disturbed soil, and they grazed with a ruthlessness the native grasses had never encountered. In a matter of decades, the delicate composition of the prairie, the woodland, or the savanna was fundamentally altered. We were changing the menu right out from under the feet of the people who depended on it. Where a traditional hunter relied on specific native species that thrived in high ecological diversity, our cattle turned the diversity into uniformity. The herds we brought were not just competitors, they were biological engineers turning native pasture into a European feedlot, devastating the roots, compacting the soil, and ensuring that the traditional food sources could no longer sustain the population base built over centuries. And what did we offer in exchange for this ecological ruin? Trade. Initially, trade seemed beneficial, even mutually advantageous. We offered steel axes, copper pots, and glass beads, items that were indisputably superior in terms of efficiency and durability compared to stone tools and ceramics. This was a trap disguised as technology. To get the superior axe, they needed something we wanted, and what we wanted was volume. Furs, hides, specialized timber, or perhaps specific minerals. The very act of engaging in this trade forced them to abandon their traditional, sustainable resource management, the very systems built on longevity, and adopt a high-volume, high-extraction model. To acquire enough beaver pelts for a year's supply of manufactured goods, they had to hunt the beaver to the point of local collapse. They were forced to participate in the destruction of their own ecosystem, driven not by internal greed, but by an external, irresistible economic pressure. We handed them the shovel and told them to dig their way out of the Stone Age, knowing full well the price was the complete destabilization of their societal anchors. And let's be frank about the intention here. This was not a mistake. The concept of clearing the land was essential to the expanding culture's ideology. If the forgotten people were too efficient, too sustainable, or too numerous, they posed a permanent, inconvenient barrier to our expansion. But if they became dependent on our goods, and if their land simultaneously became barren and incapable of supporting their traditional lifestyle, they had only two options left: starvation or assimilation. We engineered a crisis of competence. Imagine being an elder, a keeper of the ancient wisdom whose entire life was dedicated to knowing how to survive winter, how to find water during drought, and how to read the migration patterns. Now, that wisdom is useless. The stream has dried up because the settlers' sheep ate the stabilizing roots upriver. The bison are gone, replaced by fenced cows. The medicinal plants, which only grow in the old forest mosaic, are choked out by invasive thistle brought in European grain. The accumulated knowledge of 10,000 years was rendered obsolete in a single lifetime. This dependency and ecological shock created an immediate, agonizing demographic shift. We talk about the great slaughters and the battles, but the true tragedy happened quietly, in the fields and forests, far from the organized conflict. The people who survived the initial pandemic waves were now too weak to hunt, their bodies racked by unfamiliar disease, their traditional food sources depleted, and their movements restricted by new boundary lines, the fences we imposed. Suddenly, the people who had mastered the landscape were aliens in their own home. They looked out at the scarred earth, the strange cattle, and the aggressive weeds, and they were forced to acknowledge an impossible truth. The land itself, their oldest ancestor and most reliable partner, had been silently, irrevocably infected by the foreign world we brought. And that infection meant that even if we left, their original life could never be restored. The clock of human history, which had run separately for millennia, was not just stopped, it was violently smashed. They were witnessing the death of their home, and they were watching us take meticulous notes on the quality of the new soil we intended to farm on the graves of their culture. That realization, the silent, irrevocable infection of the soil. That was the environmental apocalypse. But we weren't done observing. We were just moving on to the sociological experiment. You see, if the people couldn't sustain themselves on the diseased land, and if the diseases we introduced kept thinning their numbers, what was the logical next step for the settlers? Protection? Maybe in the most cynical, bureaucratic sense of the word. We created the perimeter, the boundary lines that were not simply political maps drawn in faraway capitals, but physical manifestations of our desire for isolation. The reserves, the reservations, the segregated zones. We designated pockets of land, almost universally the least fertile, the most marginal ground we didn't want for our monocultures or our mining operations, and declared that this was where the remnants of the forgotten species would live. Think about the psychological whiplash here. For millennia, their lives were defined by vast, open, interconnected landscapes, the migration routes of the bison, the fishing cycles of the river, the traditional hunting grounds that stretched hundreds of miles and connected dozens of kin groups. Suddenly, their entire universe was reduced to a few square miles of subpar grazing land, ringed by our barbed wire and patrolled by our newly appointed officials. We shrunk the world to a size manageable by our bureaucracy, and with that shrinkage, the social hierarchy crumbled. We often speak of the loss of life, but we rarely focus on the calculated destruction of governance. A chief, a clan leader, a shaman, their authority was tied directly to their ability to provide for the community, to interpret the land, and to successfully execute the ancient necessary rituals. But what happens when the rituals are irrelevant because the game is gone? What happens when the traditional medicines fail against a sickness nobody has ever seen before? What happens when the only thing keeping the community fed is a meager, government-issued sack of flour distributed by a clerk who speaks a foreign language? Authority shifts instantly. The power flows not to the wisest or the strongest among them, but to the person who can navigate our paperwork. The traditional leader is now powerless, watching their influence bleed away to the younger man who speaks enough of our tongue to negotiate the ration allotments. We didn't have to conquer their leadership. We simply made their leadership functionally obsolete. We made their wisdom a historical footnote. This wasn't accidental. It was the precise function of what we called civilization. We were not integrating them. We were forcing them into absolute dependency. Their ancestral identity, the very thing that had allowed them to survive in isolation for those 30,000 years, was now a liability. Survival became synonymous with abandoning self, and then we came for the future. The most profound, most invasive strategy in this campaign against the forgotten species was the war on their children, because adults might cling to the memory of the buffalo hunt or the old ceremonies, but children are malleable. Children are the vessel for the next 50 years of culture, and we decided that those vessels needed to be emptied and refilled. Across continent after continent, the same brutal program unfolded: compulsory assimilation. We didn't just preach Christianity, we abducted the soul. The kids were taken, often forcibly, sometimes under the false promise of education or adequate feeding, and shipped far away to institutions where their language was beaten out of them, where their names were replaced with generic English or French designations, John, Mary, Robert, and where their hair, which often held profound spiritual significance, was violently shorn. Imagine the trauma. You are 6 years old. You are plucked from the comforting ancient rhythms of your kin, where every sound, every plant, every story makes sense. You are thrown into a sterile, cold, alien environment, forbidden to speak the only language you know. When you cry out for your mother, you are punished. When you use your native tongue, you are told that it is the language of the devil, the language of the forgotten, the language of the doomed. We weren't just teaching them to read our books. We were actively destroying their capacity to remember who they were. We were committing an active, bureaucratic, and often highly financed genocide of memory. We wanted them to return to their communities, if they survived the diseases and the abuse in those schools, as strangers, as agents of the very culture that had imprisoned their parents. It was a brilliant, wicked trap. If they remained purely traditional, they starved or died of disease outside the fences we built. If they accepted our terms, they survived, but only as pale, traumatized reflections, fundamentally disconnected from the land, the spirits, and the stories that made them whole. We monitored their pain. We took meticulous records of their conversion rates, their obedience, and the percentage decrease in the use of their native dialects. We studied the slow death of their culture as if it were a fascinating, tragic experiment, forgetting that these were our contemporaries, the human beings who had simply taken a different fork in the long road of history. This is the point where the isolation became complete. They were isolated from their land, isolated from their past, and perhaps most tragically, isolated from themselves. Survival meant accepting the premise that their ancestors were wrong, that their culture was defective, and that the foreign intruders, us, the people who brought plague and fences, were the only source of truth and sustenance. So, they swallowed the pride. They learned the new language, not to debate us, not to defeat us, but simply to ask for the rations, to beg for the release of a child, to negotiate the pathetic terms of their continued, diminished existence on the scraps of their own ancestral home. But you have to wonder, when you are forced to use the conqueror's language to ask for bread, what exactly are you sacrificing? And what happens when the spirit, subjected to such unrelenting bureaucratic violence, finally decides that survival at any cost is no longer worth the price of the soul? This realization, this ultimate moment of human surrender or quiet rebellion, is where the true, complex tragedy begins. And that is the moment we deliberately ignored. When we discuss historical tragedies, we often focus on the grand, dramatic moments, the battles, the sieges, the treaties being signed under duress. But the deepest tragedy, the systemic destruction of the human spirit that occurred here, wasn't written in blood on a battlefield. It was written in ledger books, across endless lines of administrative paperwork, signed and approved by men who never had to look these people in the eye. We didn't just take the land, we took the definition of the self. Think about the absurdity of it. We, the intruders, the latecomers, the ones who failed to understand the ecosystem they had mastered for millennia, suddenly became the sole arbiters of what constituted a human being, a nation, or a civilized culture. And we codified it. We built bureaucratic walls higher and thicker than any physical fence. This is where the idea of the forgotten species truly solidified. Not because we literally forgot them, but because we stopped acknowledging them as complex, sovereign human beings. They became entries on a government spreadsheet, assets to be managed, liabilities to be mitigated. To us, they were not people with a rich, ancient history. They were an obstacle to progress, a problem to be solved through assimilation. And we decided that the solution wasn't negotiation nor respect, but sheer, unrelenting institutional violence. The first, most necessary step in this process was to legally disassemble their society. We defined who was Indian and who wasn't. We created systems, reservations, or reserves that weren't places of sanctuary, but prisons disguised as administrative districts, often located on the least productive, most marginal lands. Crucially, we ensured that this segregated existence was dependent on our continuing goodwill. We controlled the food, the access to markets, the ability to leave, and even the right to manage their own minimal finances. You see, starvation is a powerful tool, but dependency is a permanent leash. When the spirit starts to fight back, when the elders cling fiercely to their rituals and their language, the administrative solution becomes surgical. You don't target the present, you target the future. And that brings us to what is perhaps the most chilling aspect of this erasure. The system we built specifically to destroy the child in order to save the resource. We called them residential schools or boarding schools. We told ourselves, and this is important, this is the lie we kept repeating, that we were saving these children from savagery, preparing them for civilization. But the true, articulated goal, often stated by the very officials running these programs, was chillingly simple: kill the Indian in the child. We rip children, some as young as 4 or 5, from their families, often with the assistance of uniformed police. We cut their hair, strip them of their ancestral clothes, and beat the indigenous languages right out of their mouths. If their language was their connection to the past, their history, and their soul, then silencing it was the most effective way to ensure that the chain of cultural transmission snapped forever. Imagine you are a parent, powerless on the reservation, watching a government agent take your child. You know the violence that awaits them, the documented physical, sexual, and psychological abuse that was rampant in these institutions, often perpetrated by the clergy or state officials we trusted to civilize them. But you are faced with a horrific choice. If you resist, your family may starve entirely, or you may be jailed. If you comply, your child returns years later, if they return at all, speaking a foreign tongue, alienated from their own people, and burdened by trauma that will define generations. It was a perfect, diabolical trap. Survival meant the permanent destruction of the family unit, the ultimate social isolation internalized. This institutional abuse created a wound that runs deeper than anything physical. We created deep internal schisms within the community itself. To navigate the new, brutal reality, some people had to adapt faster. They learned the conqueror's language perfectly. They mastered our rules. They sometimes took positions of minimal authority, becoming the necessary intermediaries, the interpreters, the negotiators, the ones forced to enforce the very policies that were killing their culture, simply to secure a tiny, momentary advantage for their kin. This necessary compromise, this ultimate submission to the bureaucratic knife, bred a profound, agonizing mistrust. How do you distinguish between the necessary collaborator and the true traitor when the only way to survive is to speak the master's tongue? When the only way to eat is to enforce the master's rules? And we watched it all happen. We funded the schools, we enforced the isolation, and we perpetuated the dependency. We created the very conditions, poverty, loss of identity, enforced idleness, that we then pointed to as proof of their inherent inferiority. Look, we would say, comfortably removed in our cities. They cannot govern themselves. They are prone to vice and dependency. They need our continued guidance. We manufactured the failure and then blamed the victim for the result of the procedure. But the human spirit, even when battered into submission, does not just vanish, it mutates. When the formal channels of culture are blocked, when the language is suppressed and the elders are humiliated, the deep historical pain has to find an outlet. It surfaces in quiet desperation, in the erosion of health, in cycles of addiction and generational trauma that become their own agonizing form of ongoing historical isolation. And the tragedy? We created a population that was perfectly isolated, perfectly dependent, and perfectly broken. We succeeded in creating a forgotten species right here among us, a people whose only remaining identity, in the eyes of the state, was their need for administrative aid. And that is exactly the moment we realized we had to make a choice. Either continue to ignore the immense institutional violence that created this state, or finally acknowledge that the failure wasn't theirs. The failure was ours. And the consequences of our long, deliberate silence were about to become horrifyingly clear and entirely unavoidable. The consequences. You see, institutional violence doesn't stay theoretical forever. It doesn't remain a quiet policy decision made in a wood-paneled room. It leaks out. It becomes a physical, undeniable reality that requires real-world intervention, usually the most expensive kind. We spent decades creating the perfect pressure cooker, locking away pain, suppressing language, delegitimizing entire ways of knowing the world. And pain, as we know, requires an outlet. When that outlet isn't healthy cultural expression, when it isn't dignity or self-determination, it becomes measurable statistics. This is where the mask really slips off, isn't it? Suddenly, the forgotten species isn't just an administrative headache, they are a public health crisis. Look at the numbers, and I mean, really look at them. In the isolated communities, the rates of preventable disease weren't just slightly higher than the national average. They were catastrophic. We're talking tuberculosis rates that mirrored 19th century Europe, flourishing in housing designed to fail. We're talking infant mortality rates that defy the medical advancements of the era. The life expectancy gap? It wasn't a few years. It was often 15, 20, sometimes even 30 years shorter than the majority population living just a few hundred miles away. You and I, we get 70, maybe a little more. They were lucky to make 55, crippled by diseases exacerbated, if not directly caused, by chronic malnutrition and environmental decay, the direct results of forced dependency and economic isolation. This is where the system performs its final, cruelest trick. When the historical trauma manifests as crippling addiction or deep-seated despair, the state doesn't look back at the original crime, the cultural genocide, the land theft, the suppression. No. It looks forward through the lens of bureaucracy and redefines the historic problem as a clinical one. This is the great medicalization of misery. We didn't see people suffering from intergenerational systemic violence. We saw alcoholics. We didn't see communities crushed by hopelessness and administrative failure. We saw mood disorders and failure to thrive. Do you understand the sleight of hand here? By assigning an individual diagnosis, we successfully absolved the system of its collective guilt. The failure was no longer ours, the institutional structure that created the conditions. The failure belonged to the individual whose body and mind had finally, inevitably broken under the strain. And so, the solution proposed wasn't genuine autonomy or restoration of land and culture. It was more administration, more social workers, more doctors arriving with clipboards and prescriptions, ready to treat the symptoms of the infection we ourselves had introduced. This bureaucratic response created what historians now call the second wave of cultural loss. The first wave took the children away to residential schools, crushing language and family structure. The second wave, operating under the guise of compassion and child welfare, took children away because the residual poverty that we enforced made the environment unsafe. Think about that agonizing choice, or lack thereof. A mother is living in housing the state provides. Housing that is often structurally unsound, riddled with mold, and overcrowded. She might be battling the addiction that her parents developed in the residential schools. Her child is sick. The social worker arrives, fulfilling their mandated duty, and deems the child at risk due to the environment. The child is removed. We have now achieved total institutional control. The community cannot care for its members because we destroyed its resources. The family unit cannot sustain itself because we shredded its generational knowledge and economic base. And when the inevitable collapse happens, we swoop in, claiming to be the savior, and enforce the permanent dependency of the next generation. The cycle is perfectly closed. The tragedy of the forgotten species reaches its peak here. They were so perfectly marginalized, so invisible to the national narrative, that their suffering was only noticed when it became financially inconvenient for the state. But eventually, even the most well-oiled bureaucratic machine runs out of places to hide the bodies. The costs spiraled. The hospitals could no longer handle the influx. The courts were overwhelmed. The despair boiled over from individual tragedy into highly visible community-wide crises, protests, riots, mass hunger strikes, or horrifyingly, spikes in youth suicide rates that demanded international attention. Suddenly, the forgotten people were standing in the light. Not because we finally chose to see them as human equals, but because the crisis they represented was too large, too costly, and too loud to ignore any longer. And here is the crucial moment, the pivot point in this history. The National Society, you and I, the inheritors of the system, were forced to look at the wreckage. We saw the decades of deliberate silence, the systemic violence, and the human cost laid bare. And then came the most profound realization of all, the one that broke the narrative we had told ourselves for generations. We realized that fixing this didn't just mean allocating more funds. Fixing this didn't mean adding another layer of administration. Fixing this meant acknowledging that the damage was foundational. It meant that if we were going to truly address the isolation, we couldn't just treat the symptoms of the broken people. We had to dismantle the very narratives, the very laws, and the very power structures that had made them broken in the first place. And that requirement, my friends, demanded a cost we were absolutely terrified to pay, because it meant we had to finally admit who we were and what we had done in the cold, hard light of day. And what we found waiting for us on the other side of that reckoning was not redemption, but the terrifying responsibility of deciding whether or not we were willing to sacrifice our own comfort for genuine justice. A sacrifice that might demand the total restructuring of our society, our land, and our identity. The choice was no longer theoretical. It was right there, staring us down, and the clock was already ticking towards zero. We ended last time staring straight into the abyss of our own creation. We had built a society that demanded isolation for some to guarantee comfort for others. And now, to fix it, we needed to sacrifice the very comfort that defined us. What does that look like in the cold, hard reality? It looks like demolition, not of buildings, but of foundational narratives. It means accepting that the human species, the great traveler, the continent conqueror, did not conquer through flawless adaptation, but through structural violence and calculated displacement. We talk about the forgotten human species, the ones left behind when Homo sapiens marched toward Europe, toward agricultural revolution, toward history as we wrote it. But the truth, the absolutely terrifying truth of the archaeological record, is that they weren't simply forgotten. They were outmaneuvered, outcompeted, and deliberately excluded. Look at the timelines. Look at the genetic evidence. We carry the ghosts of their DNA within us, the small, tenacious segments of Neanderthal and Denisovan heritage that whisper of ancient, imperfect admixture. We didn't replace them instantly or cleanly. We lived alongside them for millennia. We saw them. We knew them. And then, slowly, we built systems, social, territorial, technological, that made their way of life unsustainable, marginalizing them until their populations collapsed or were absorbed into the dominant culture at the very lowest strata. This pattern, my friends, is the foundational algorithm of human history. When we talk about the species we abandoned, we are not just talking about distant relatives with different cranial shapes and robust physiques. We are talking about the process of abandonment itself. That process didn't stop 40,000 years ago, when the last established Neanderthal population faded from the fossil record. It became the template for every act of human marginalization that followed. Because once we established the precedent that some humans were destined for the center stage of progress and others were destined to be the historical footnote, or worse, the fuel for our progress, we never stopped applying that rule. We chased the relics of the past, the stones, the bones, seeking the definitive moment where the forgotten disappeared. But the real answer isn't in prehistory, it is in the present. The forgotten species are those whose isolation we have actively maintained for centuries. The uncontacted tribes whose land we encroach upon, the indigenous populations whose language and histories we erase, the structurally marginalized people worldwide whose existence is defined by their deliberate exclusion from the benefits of our civilization. We made them inconvenient. We made their narratives messy. We made them the other, defined by the systems we built to keep ourselves pure and our ascent linear. This is where the reckoning begins. The structural injustice we identified in the last part, the required sacrifice, is the dismantling of the myth of linear progress. We have to look at the massive technological leaps, the soaring towers, the sprawling agricultural fields, and ask, Who paid the cost for this singular narrative of advancement? Who was the resource? Who was isolated so that we could be connected? The academic consensus is overwhelming on this point. Isolation is not a natural state. It is often a political outcome. When the Great Migrations occurred, the human groups who chose or were forced to remain in specific environments, often remote, developed unique biological and cultural adaptations. But then the dominant, highly networked populations arrived, the imperialists, the colonizers, the resource extractors, and suddenly those highly adapted, isolated groups were not viewed as fellow humans with unique histories. They were seen as obstacles or anthropological curiosities destined to either assimilate or vanish. The greatest trick history ever played on us was convincing us that the forgotten people simply failed to catch up. They didn't fail. They were stopped. The systemic isolation we must address today, the economic ghettos, the resource deserts, the historical blind spots, are not historical accidents. They are the direct, traceable continuation of that ancient instinct to marginalize the other, to secure resources by defining someone else as less worthy of them. Our failure to address the isolation of the present is our ultimate endorsement of the abandonment of the past. We talked about paying the terrifying cost. The cost is acknowledging that the damage is not superficial. It is not just about writing a few new history books or enacting small, performative reforms. It is about accepting that the wealth, the identity, and the very ground beneath our feet often rest on the silence and the engineered isolation of the forgotten. Imagine for a moment the shift in our global identity if we truly centered the narratives of the forgotten, not as tragedy, but as legitimate parallel paths of human development. If we admitted that the human story is not a single river flowing to the sea of modernity, but a vast, sprawling delta with countless streams and estuaries, many of which we blocked or poisoned. We have the evidence now. The science is definitive. We are one species, deeply interconnected, carrying the genetic echoes of displacement and intermingling. The archaeological record proves coexistence. The historical record proves systemic marginalization. We have all the facts we need. The question is no longer what happened. The question is, what are we going to do with the truth? To genuinely break the cycle of isolation requires us to willingly step out of our privileged comfort and demand that the entire stage be reconstructed. It means acknowledging that justice for the marginalized requires sacrifice from the center. It means rebuilding our systems so that the survival and flourishing of the few no longer depends on the active or passive destruction of the many. We are, right now, standing at the same crossroads our ancestors faced when they encountered the other. Do we choose to absorb and marginalize, or do we choose true integration? Do we continue to define progress by exclusion or by inclusion? The clock is ticking. The choice is ours. But the consequences will be history's judgment on whether we, the species that conquered the world, were capable of learning the simplest, most terrifying lesson of all, that the strength of humanity is measured not by how high its dominant towers reach, but by how few of its people are left standing alone, forgotten in the darkness below. The forgotten species still exists. It is the part of us we chose to suppress. And until we look at the face of that forgotten history, we remain isolated from our own full humanity. The reckoning is not coming. The reckoning is here, and it demands an answer.